Hi. Well, here we are with John Milton. After, arguably, Chaucer and Shakespeare, probably the third greatest poet that we're looking at this semester. Now, Milton comes to us at an interesting time. Born in 1608, okay, so during the reign of James I. And he comes into adulthood during the reign of Charles I. And if you saw the video that I made as the introduction to this time period, you remember that Charles, like his father, but even more so, resented having to share power. Basically, it's like, what's the point of being the king if you have a parliament, right? And indeed, Charles dissolved parliament, right? He refused to have parliament meet for a very long stretch. Now, parliament was controlled basically by Puritans. So remember what I was saying before in the video introduction. After you have the split of England from the Roman Catholic Church, and Henry VIII creates the Church of England, you've got that thing going on. But also, you have a brand, if you will, of Protestantism that really comes from a very different perspective. In other words, one could make the argument that Henry VIII's decision to split from the Catholic Church, and I know I'm oversimplifying here, but essentially had mostly to do with the fact that he was unable to conceive a male heir with his wife, Catherine of Aragon, and decided that he needed a new queen, and he could not leave Catherine in the Roman Church, right? That the Catholic Church did not allow divorce, and the conditions for an annulment were nowhere near met. And so he creates the Church of England and gets himself an annulment, right? But on the continent, with Martin Luther and the 95 Theses and John Calvin and all these other people who are really separating from the Roman Catholic Church over very important dogmatic issues, differences, okay? And so when Henry creates the Church of England, in many ways, you could look at it as just a political move, right? Not based necessarily on deeply felt dogmatic differences like Martin Luther had. But the dissenters, or Puritans, looked at the English church and said that it needed to be purified of its more Catholic aspects, the kind of holdovers from Catholicism that the Anglican Church, at least the High Anglican Church, still had. So you had what was called High and Low Church. The Low Church was more stripped down Puritan, and then you had the Anglicans, who looked kind of like Catholics in many ways, right? The services were actually very similar, okay? Now, over time, this evolves into a threat, okay? And as I mentioned, James saw this because the Puritans, essentially by not really recognizing hierarchical authorities in the church, well, that's not hard to translate that pretty quickly into political hierarchy, right? And he saw that. And then his son James comes into power, as I said, his son Charles, I'm sorry, James's son Charles, the first, comes into power, and he is considered also to be very much a royalist who believes in kingly power. He's also taken to have Catholic sympathies. In fact, he has a French wife, right? Now, Milton was a supporter of Oliver Cromwell. I mentioned Oliver Cromwell before as the leader, who basically became the leader of the Puritans in the Puritan War. And after the Puritans won the war, executed Charles, Oliver Cromwell, became the king. Not the king, but the leader of England. I'm sorry, he wasn't a king. Eventually, Cromwell, of course, dies. His son is placed in his stead, but that doesn't last very long, about 2 years. And eventually, the son of Charles II, is brought back from France with his family, and we have what's called the Restoration. Now, this happens in 1660. Okay. Now, I mention this because Paradise Lost is written in 1667. In other words, Cromwell's great work was written after the return of the king. Right? Borrow a phrase. And so it has different layers of meaning here, right? What is this paradise that has been lost? On the one hand, obviously, we have the story from Genesis. By the way, I encourage you to read the story of Eden in the book of Genesis. It's not very long. In fact, you can read it quite quickly, quite easily. It's not much, in other words. And yet, Milton blows it all up into this huge epic poem. The epic poem is the appropriate form because it is, like the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Aeneid, right? The highest level of poetic achievement. Also, when you looked at the Iliad and the Aeneid and those other great poems, right? They were poems really about the founding of a nation, whether it's the Greeks or the Romans or the imitators who came afterwards. But Milton is very self-conscious about this whole process, right? And he knows about the classics really, really well, but he's like moving away from them, right? He's taking their ideas and expanding on top of those ideas to create Paradise Lost, because in his mind, he's not talking about the founding of Rome or the founding of ancient Greece. This is everything, right? When you talk about Genesis, you're talking about the beginning of all human life. All human life. And particularly, of course, it centers ultimately on Christ. But we're not reading that part of Paradise Lost. Right? We're just reading books 1, 2, and 9. Now, I do also want to point out, before we even begin book 1, the second edition, printed in 1674, where you have the verse. Right? He has a paragraph here in which he talks about rhyming and why his lines do not rhyme. Okay? Now, we came from the metaphysical poets. Remember Andrew Marvell, for instance, wrote iambic tetrameter lines. Iambic soft hard, tetra 4, okay? So there are 4 lines, or 4 beats in every line, 4 meters, okay? Milton uses the iambic pentameter, right? The longer line. It's a more serious line, okay? But also he avoids rhyming. And I'll just read what he says here. The jingling sound of like endings, right? He calls it the jingling sound of like endings. He considers it barbarous, bad poetry, bad writing, right? The invention of a barbarous age to set off wretched matter and lame meter. Now, of course, part of what Milton is doing here is a very, very common thing. And that is to degrade the practices of the present, to embrace some past, right? And the idea that the present poetry is inferior to how things used to be. And so he is going to write his poetry with these blank lines, right? The iambic pentameter unrhymed lines, which doesn't mean that he's not using, sound at all. In fact, he does. Alliteration, assonance, right? Consonants. He uses sound very much so. The flow of the lines, that kind of thing. You have to pay very great attention to it. But he doesn't want to get bogged down into what he talks about as the jingling sound of like endings. Right? He's going to stay away from that. So that's a very important little note at the beginning of the book 1. Now, when we look at book 1 in Paradise Lost, one of the things really important to pay attention to is this kind of combination of the classical epic and what he intends to write from the Christian perspective, his notion. So he uses this classical form, and he uses bits and pieces of what would be expected in the classical epic, particularly as laid out by Virgil. Right? So he begins, first of all, with an appeal to the muse. Right? The muse being that goddess that you need help from to write a better poem than you would otherwise be capable of doing. Right? And notice, by the way, when people tell you that punning is low class, Shakespeare punned, John Milton puns. Oh my gosh, you can't stop these guys. Of man's disobedience and the fruit, double meaning on fruit, of that forbidden tree whose mortal taste brought death into the world and all our woe with loss of Eden, till one greater man restore us and regain the blissful seat. Sing, heavenly muse, that on the secret top of Oreb or of Sinai didst inspire that shepherd who first taught the chosen seed. In the beginning, how the heavens and earth rose out of chaos, or if Zion hill delight thee more, and Siola's brook that flowed fast by the oracle of God, I thence invoke thy aid to my adventurous song, that with no middle flight intends to soar above the Aeonian mount, while it pursues things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme. I love that line, while it pursues things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme, which is funny because if you see the footnote, that's plagiarism from Orlando Furioso by a writer named Ariosto in Italian. Okay. But no middle flight. He's not going to try to do something mediocre. He is going for it all, right? He's trying to reach for the heights, okay? He's trying to reach up very, very high. And then there is what's called the epic question, right? The opening question, what is this all about, per se, right? Say first, for heaven hides nothing from thy view, nor the deep tract of hell. Say first, what cause moved our grandparents, and again there's a pun, right? Grand as in wonderful, grand as in old. In that happy state, favored of heaven so highly, to fall off from their creator and transgress his will, for one restraint lords of the world besides. Right? Why did they do this? How could Adam and Eve have done this to us? This is ridiculous. How irresponsible. Right? Then we wind up having to live with disease and death and war and all these horrible things that have happened all because they ate an apple. No, they didn't really. It's not really an apple, but that's okay. Right? So, in part 2, I want to take a look at Satan. So, let's see what happens there.